You're listening to the Oncology Nursing Podcast, where ONS Voices Talk Cancer, a resource from the Oncology Nursing Society. Through conversations with subject matter experts, we examine the important issues in oncology nursing, from new treatments to patient-centered research to advancements in clinical practice. Join us as we hear from nurses in all facets of oncology care, from benchside to bedside and everywhere in between. Welcome to the Oncology Nursing Podcast.
The advertising messages in this episode are sponsored by the University of Cincinnati Online. Want to help cancer patients outside of the hospital room? Try a career as a cancer registry professional. Earn your certificate for cancer registry management online through the University of Cincinnati. Get details at online.uc.edu. Hello, and welcome to the Oncology Nursing Podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie Jardine, Oncology Clinical Specialist at ONS, and today we are joined by ONS member Mo Schwartz, Professor of Pharmacy Practice at the University of Cincinnati's James L. Winkle College of Pharmacy, to discuss what oncology nurses need to know about U.S. Food and Drug Administration approvals over the past year. Mo presented on this topic during an ONS Bridge session in September 2020. Thanks for joining me today, Mo.
You are very welcome. I look forward to it.
So to start us off, what crucial FDA updates regarding cancer treatment took place in the last year?
So many new approvals, but not only new approvals of drugs, expanding indications for many of the drugs that we currently have. And I think that is really important because when a drug is approved for a specific indication, we know that as there are results of more clinical trials, that the use will expand. And so we've had a lot of that. The other things just to be aware of that I didn't mention much when we talked during the ONS Bridge session is that there are changes in doses, in dosing regimens for different agents, as well as some indications in terms of toxicities that we need to be aware of. So those are just kind of like a high-level view of the type of information that continues to evolve and come out that is important for those of us in practice.
Okay. So on average, then, how many drug updates does the FDA release annually or this past year in comparison?
So this last year has been a very active year for both clinical trials, the results of clinical trials. So if you kind of keep up with the literature in Journal of Clinical Oncology or New England Journal of Medicine, there's been a lot of landmark studies with new drugs. And so those drugs, once the studies are complete, they go through the approval process, and there's been a number of new approvals. So if you look at just new drugs, probably in the last 5 years, it averages around 15, 16. I think there have been more this year, and we're on track for an even higher number this year. But if you look overall at things like new drug approvals, expanding indications, new formulations, in 2020 alone, it's been about 50. I looked at 2019, and just looking at those kind of changes, it looked like it was about 50. So we're really on this kind of fast track of changing drug indications and applications.
That just is so amazing for those working in clinical practice and just shows how important it is to be aware of that because the changes are happening so quickly. So if that is the case, what would oncology nurses need to be aware of regarding those updates?
This is the area that I've been thinking a lot about because I often talk about like new drugs, new strategies, new targets, the pharmacology. But in practice, every day, what I am faced with is what we as healthcare professionals that take care of patients need to be aware of. And specifically, I'll address nursing, but I can't help but kind of go broad. We need to be aware of new drugs, what the indications that are currently approved, because as new drugs are being evaluated, there are often studies looking at a number of different applications. So we need to know which ones are actually the ones that have been approved by the FDA and are part of package labeling. The reason that's really important is because when we want to implement a new drug, often the ability for that drug to be paid for by payers is dependent upon the package labeling. So we need to know not only what drugs are available, but what their indications are per labeling, because we have to take probably extra steps if it's beyond the package label. We need to know changes in doses, regimens, and new information about safety. And so as we get so involved with so many new drugs, it's kind of hard to pick up a new safety concern that may be published. So those are some of the things to look at. It's so easy to list those things. I think the challenge is how we do that. And I'm really glad we're having this podcast so we can talk about that.
Yeah, I think it can definitely be something, and it's very overwhelming for folks in knowing that. And I think it is good that we're having this talk to really try to understand what the best way to go about this would be. So can you walk us through the process for cancer drug research and clinical trials? Because that might help set the stage for what we need to look for.
I can. And one of the things I'm going to say is that one of the advances in the last 5 to 10 years in oncology has been kind of a modification or an evolution of clinical drug development in oncology, simply to try to develop drugs that are needed for patients in a safe way, but faster. So even though I'm going to go over kind of the phases, key thing to think about is that this is an evolving strategy, and I think that's a really good thing. So if we look at how we look at drug development, we have phase 1 clinical trials. And in phase 1 clinical trials, historically, what we look at is safety. We try to determine the maximum tolerated dose. And then that dose is what goes into phase 2 trials. So we often use these drugs in phase 1 studies in those patients that don't have good treatment options available. So a couple things to say about phase 1 trials. Phase 1 trials are really important. We learn a lot about a drug in a phase 1 trial. But one of the strategies that has been looked at is that instead of just doing a phase 1 trial alone, to look at phase 1 and phase 2 trials together. So a phase 2 trial is when you look at efficacy in a certain cancer. So you have that kind of dose that you found is safe in phase 1 trials, you take it to a phase 2 trial in a certain patient population with a certain cancer, and you see how efficacious it is. You still get safety. You still try to learn as much as you can. So one of the strategies that you've seen develop in recent years is strategies to do phase 1-2 studies, so that the phase 1 part of a trial is the dose escalation. But then once you get the dose that you feel is good to go to phase 2, that there's an expanded cohort. There's a cohort where you get expansion, that you get more patients with a specific cancer put on that dose. That kind of helps get those studies done a little bit faster. Phase 3 trials are clinical trials where you compare a new treatment with a current standard. Now, that new treatment may be a specific drug, or it may be a combination of drugs or a strategy of how you use the drug, say with radiation. So that's comparing to current standards. So when you look at this process overall, there's lots of things that are changing. Our eligibility criteria used to be extremely strict because we wanted patients that went on to phase 1 trials to be relatively healthy, knowing that when we take that information we get from phase 1 trials and phase 2 trials, we take it to the general population, maybe those criteria we had in clinical trials are not the criteria that we have in the patients that we're treating. So you're seeing some of that eligibility criteria kind of loosen up, still looking clearly at patient safety, but being a little bit more realistic, comparing trials to what the patient population we see in clinic.
So we've talked about the clinical trial phases for standard therapy, but with new targeted therapies being really coming to the forefront, do we use the same clinical trials method or phases to do those as well?
That's a great question, because I will say, and I think I probably even said this during the ONS Bridge session, my favorite term now is actionable mutational alteration, because growing up in an era where we looked at cancer by the histology, or actually by the tissue. So we looked at lung cancer, and then we learned to look at lung cancer as different diseases, whether it was small cell or adenocarcinoma or squamous cell. We're now stepping back and looking more at not just the histology, which is still important, but to look at the biology in an individual patient. So to look within a patient's cancer, are there mutations that are going to be a good target for a drug? So clinical trials looking at, say, efficacy may not look at just patients with lung cancer for that target. It may look at all patients that have that mutation and then looking at efficacy. Often in these clinical trials, you still will have results when the publications come out, talk about when you have this target in, say, lung cancer, this is the effect. When you have this target and you use an inhibitor to the target in thyroid cancer, this is the percentage of response that you'll see. Because instead of saying the target is the most important thing, or saying that the site of disease is the most important thing, it may be a target works differently in different types of cancer. And so it's important that we still look at safety, phase 1 data. We still look at efficacy, but it's going to be important to look a little bit closer at not only the mutation, but also the mutation in specific cancers. So I think it adds another level of complexity, but I think it helps us. So instead of saying a patient with this mutation, we should target it with this drug, we may be able to better pick out the patient who will respond by knowing more about what the type of mutation is. So it's not simply an EGFR mutation, it may be the subtype of mutation. And it may be important to look at if that mutation exists in thyroid cancer or breast cancer. So lots to learn. And the good thing about the evolving science is that the clinical trials really do try to evaluate these questions before the drug makes it onto market. I hope that made sense. And if it doesn't, please ask me to clarify anything I need to.
No, it definitely does. And I think that that is also one of the most amazing things that is happening in the development of treatment for cancer and just in those targets where, like you said, we used to think, oh, it was a lung cancer, so this is what has to, be used for treatment with lung cancer. But now looking at those different targets or mutations, and if that tumor testing is being done early enough and can identify what those are, how much better suited the treatments might be for that patient, where it may not have been, it was considered the gold standard in those earlier years, but now that's not the best option for folks. So I think that's just a really important and exciting thing with all of this. So one of the things that I know also with not only new treatments that are coming out, but, has happened in the past, is that combination therapy, whether it's a single drug treatment or combination drugs or in combination with maybe radiation or looking at conventional chemotherapy and immunotherapy now. So do the studies, is it done the same way, or how do the trials, or the researchers pull that into consideration when looking at this?
I think the question of how we use these agents with other treatments, combination, and the other concept I think that I should just mention a little bit is sequencing is becoming one of the biggest questions in clinical practice. So we have different drugs to treat somebody that has a adenocarcinoma of the lung. We want to know what's the best treatment, and there's different targets that may be beneficial. What's the best way to treat it? Can we combine things together? Is that going to be the best approach? Should we sequence things? Is there an optimal way to sequence? And those are questions that clinical trials really need to answer. So one of the things that you'll see in clinical trials is we often talk about development of a new drug. So this new drug goes through phase 1, 2, and 3. But the other thing that is really important to look at are clinical trials when you take that new drug and you combine it with either other standard forms of pharmacotherapy, say with chemotherapy. I always think of, when I think of the immune checkpoint inhibitors, the initial trials of combining immune checkpoint inhibitors when they were newer therapies with chemotherapy in specific disease sites. That became really important because we needed to learn about how these drugs impact each other, if they did it in a way that was 1 + 1 = 5, or if they decreased the efficacy of the one agent. The other thing that we needed to learn when we combined is we need to look at toxicities, because these drugs often have toxicities that overlap in terms, but not in mechanism. And what I mean by that is when I say, when you have a drug that causes diarrhea, that's a targeted agent, and you have a drug that causes diarrhea that's an immune checkpoint inhibitor, those are different mechanisms of diarrhea, but to a patient, it's diarrhea. And so we need to know how to differentiate it so that we can best treat it. Clinical trials are necessary for the combination of new drugs and radiation, and also where it fits pre-surgery, post-surgery. Those kind of questions need to be answered in those phases of clinical trial. Now, that's combination. The other thing that I think is really exciting, and this is the question I think that as practitioners we're going to see in practice, is how do we sequence these drugs? Not how do we sequence these drugs safely, but what's the optimal way to sequence to get the best impact for the patient? So I think studies for sequencing become really important as well. So clinical trials, very important for drug development, for a new drug going through the phases of clinical development. But these clinical trials are essential for learning how best to use these drugs in specific populations.
Okay, thanks. I think that definitely does help, and it definitely shows, again, the expansion of what it is that we need to look at and be aware of when we're looking at these new therapies and trials that are going on. So I'm going to ask you, what ethical issues can arise during drug therapy development, and how do research mitigate these issues or concerns?
I think it's a really good question. I'm going to just state that I think I'm a bit biased because I have been fortunate in my career to have worked with teams that do clinical trials that really are focused on optimizing patient care. And I hope everyone has that kind of opportunity. So I think one of the most important things when you look at clinical trials is to assure that patients, families, and caregivers are very informed. So informed consent is the obvious word to use, but I'm going to go a little bit broader, that they're very aware of what the clinical trial involves, the potential risks, that the emphasis is equal risk and benefit, that they know that they have the opportunity at any time to stop, and that when they agree to a clinical trial, they are very much aware of the information that is known at the time, and that as emerging information occurs, as the clinical trial evolves, that information will be shared with them. So I think informed consent is probably the easiest way to say it, but I think that's really broader than just signing a piece of paper saying I've read the consent sheet and I think I understand it. It's making sure that they're an equal partner in that clinical trial. And I think with my experience, clinical trial teams do that. And you'll notice I say clinical trial teams because I think it is the role of every member on that clinical trial, not just the primary investigator, to make sure that patients are very aware of what that clinical trial entails. And it includes, there's go, that's a better word, includes.
Great. I do agree with you when you said the clinical trials team. I think that is a very important part because, like you said, if the whole team is not aware of the complete trial, then they're not going to be able to speak to that when those questions arise. And I think that's really important for the nurses that are on the treatment delivery side of things, because they're going to be that first line of questions that come from the patients and families, and how important that is for them to be aware and be able to speak about the trial and speak about what is going to be happening with that patient, the same as the rest of the team when they were initially discussing things with the patient. So I agree with you there. I think that's really important. And talking about the nurses being aware of what that trial includes and how that will work. How can oncology nurses aid in the development of cancer therapies?
I love what you just said because you hit a point that I think is so essential. You may be a practitioner that works in the infusion suite. I'll just say infusion suite. And you're administering the drug. And you think your role is to support that clinical trial. Your role is really to be as much of a member as anybody in that clinical trial team. You need to be aware of what the approach of the trial is, what the potential complications are, and really reinforce education about whatever is known about that drug therapy. And I have to kind of readjust my thinking because I work so much in phase 1 that often we don't know a lot. But I'm going to take it a step further. So that is the infusion suite. And I hope that when we do clinical trials, that we include education about the trials to any nurse that's going to work in that infusion suite so that they feel very comfortable about the process, the trial, and the drug that they're giving. The other group that I think is really important are those nurses that take calls from individuals that are undergoing clinical trials after they leave the infusion suite. So having just had an experience with this last week, it's really on the top of my mind. But when patients go home, sometimes they experience side effects, and we need to be able to give protocol-specific recommendation for management of those toxicities in collaboration with your healthcare team, in collaboration with the PI and the clinical trials team. But we need to be able to make sure that we have that readily available so that when patients call in, they get good information that is consistent with the trial, and that we share what we do with the clinical trial team so that if someone has side effects, we do exactly what the clinical trial says to do to manage those side effects. We need to make sure that we have assessed the side effect and documented what we have done so that it can be captured for all patients that are undergoing that clinical trial. So I think the nurse in the cancer care team is an integral, important, critical role in the whole clinical trial team.
Improve patient care in new and exciting ways. The University of Cincinnati offers online programs that blend healthcare, data, and technology. With options ranging from certificates to master's degrees, now is your chance to help cancer patients like never before. Are you ready to build on your experience and take your career to the next level? Explore your options at online.uc.edu. In all of this talking, what or why would nurses need to be cognizant of the drug approvals in cancer research, other than, knowing that new drugs are coming out? And sometimes it can, like I said earlier, it can be so overwhelming because just the sheer number of them that will be coming out is so rapid. But why do we need to be aware of that?
I'm going to answer this in two parts. And the first one I'm going to say is going to sound like it's kind of a crazy first one. The reason that nurses, as all members of the healthcare team, need to be aware of these changes in treatments in terms of drug approvals and ongoing cancer research, especially within their institution, is for that nurse or practitioner themselves. It is a challenging job working in oncology. It's hard. And we need to be able to feel confident in our own knowledge. Nothing feels worse than seeing a patient getting a drug that you have no clue what it is and what it should do. And so I think one of the key reasons that nurses need to be aware of this is so that they have some confidence in their understanding of the field that they're supporting patients in. And that sounds kind of crazy, but I've watched in the last couple of years as new drugs have been coming out right and left, how people just feel overwhelmed and don't feel that they can provide the information that they need. So that I'm going to start with that. And that's going to sound crazy because the answer that probably makes the most sense is that we need to do it for patients and patient care. We need to be knowledgeable so that we're giving correct information. We need to be able to find information fast because you know what? You're not going to know it. I don't care how many CEs that you go to, what you read. If you spend your whole weekend going through the FDA website, there's always going to be more information. So we need to be really able to get information fast so we can support patients. Because in the reality of this, because we have all these new drugs and they're being rapidly incorporated into care, you said it. We don't know. And so we need to be very nimble at taking a patient situation and thinking it through and not just checking a list saying, this is not a side effect I see listed in this package insert. We need to be able to think beyond what is reported about what may happen and then report that in the literature. So in summary, that answer is you need to do it for yourself and you need to do it for your patients.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with that. Oh, I just had a thought and I wanted to say, I think, when you were saying about do it for yourself and for that confidence, one thing that I want to ask you and wonder about is you definitely have to have that confidence to be able to talk to your patients and then show them that you, understand and are confident in what you're doing to make them be okay and feel good about getting their treatment and things like that. But remembering all of those different things is overwhelming. So for me, I think instead of feeling like I need to know every single thing and I need to memorize that or I need to know, I want to know, where is it that I can go? Where can I get my hands on something quickly in the event that it is something that is new, or a patient asks you something, or it is a new drug that you've never given before? And yeah, you could pull the package insert, but is there somewhere that in the age of all of this technology that we could go to quickly to get some of that information to, make us feel a little bit more comfortable in getting ready to administer that treatment or to answer a question that a patient might have?
I'm going to say where I go to, and I pull the literature usually because I love to look at the clinical trial, but that's probably just a quirk in my personality. But if I was in a busy treatment or in the middle of a busy clinic, which is what happens at times, I actually go to the package insert. And I don't mean the one that's associated with the drug product itself, because that is, for my aged eyes, is hard to read. I go to Daily Med. Daily Med is a government website that has all the package inserts, and they tend to be updated really rapidly. So even with a new drug, there's usually the package insert there. Now, if I want a quick review, I will go to the patient information at the very end of the website, and it gives information that you can educate patients on, because it gives me a nice overview of that drug. And so depending on what you're doing, you can look at different parts. So I would recommend for every nurse to be very familiar, not with every package insert, but with the areas within the package insert that they will find helpful. So for me, I always go to the pharmacology. I always go to the patient information to look quickly at the side effects and the monitoring. I look at the kinetics because that's what I do, but those are the kind of things I would look at fast. That's a nice, reliable source that you don't have to have a special program on your computer. You can get it on your phone. I've actually been in patient's room looking at things on my phone with it while somebody else is talking to the patient. Obviously, that would just be rude if I was just looking on my phone when I was talking to the patient. I think that's a really good resource. If it's a clinical trial, that clinical trial information, you should have that available before you even think to treat. And I think that's responsibility of the clinical trial team to make sure that all members of the healthcare team have that information.
Thank you. I think that's wonderful to have a resource like that. And that's a really good point to start looking at the drug inserts and know the different areas of where to look. That's a wonderful idea. I love that. Are there misconceptions or common misconceptions about the drug approval process that people have?
I think there are. That's a little bit of a hard question for me because I'm so in the weeds and have been for most of my career, because I started out doing phase 1 trials right after I graduated from PharmD school. But I think that people are not aware of the safety standards that exist and that informed consent is so important. And so I think that's probably for a short answer, that people are not aware of the strict criteria that exist within clinical trials for patients to get every dose and for evaluating toxicities that occur. I think the other thing that sometimes people miss is that the clinical trials are very specific to that situation. So to take information from a clinical trial and extrapolate it to other scenarios may not extrapolate easily or appropriately.
So, with this year being as crazy as it has been with everything, has COVID-19 caused any changes in the processes we've been talking about so far today?
I'm sure they have, and I'm sure that it's very institution specific in some cases and trial specific in others. So when COVID first hit in the US as a significant problem, you saw clinical trials kind of be put on hold. Certainly clinical trial staff, changes in the working availability of clinical trial staff, as well as just the healthcare team overall. So I think that happened for a couple of months. Now I think some of the things that I see that are a little bit problematic is that when patients have procedures that are required for clinical trials, they may require COVID testing before. And then if there's any delay in getting the results back, that can affect some of the clinical trial procedure. And the other thing that I see both in clinical trial and beyond is that some of the symptoms that we may see with a new drug may mimic some of the symptoms that you see with COVID. And so that kind of makes it a little bit murky when you're trying to assess a toxicity. So if a toxicity is going to be fever, well, you can see that could impact what you would, how you would assess an individual patient. Those are some of the things that I see probably daily. I'm sure there's more bigger effects within the clinical trial team, within a sponsor.
So as we're wrapping up here, what's something about the evolution of cancer drug treatment that's not often discussed, but you wish people knew more about?
I guess the thing that I think is important is that you need to look at the criteria used in a clinical trial to determine what things were not addressed. So if a clinical trial had eligibility criteria that any patient with diabetes had to be well controlled, if I have a patient that doesn't have well-controlled diabetes, I need to look at things a little bit differently. So by looking at eligibility in clinical trials, it may give you some ideas of where extrapolation from the trial to practice may need to be adjusted somewhat. And I think that becomes really important with these kind of shortened strategies to get drugs approved. So that's one thing. And the other thing that I think people need to be aware of is sometimes these clinical trials are not published fully at the time of a drug approval, but there is information about the clinical trials often presented at meetings. So at the American Society of Clinical Oncology meeting, they may have presented even more fully the data than you'll see in printed abstracts. So there's information out there that you may just not be aware of.
Okay. And are there any resources that you gave us the one about, looking at the drug inserts, but are there any other resources related to cancer research and treatment development that you could recommend for patients and providers? And I know that might be different for each of those groups.
No, you're right. I think, like I said, Daily Med, which is a website by the U.S. National Library of Medicine, clinicaltrials.gov is another resource from the U.S. National Library of Medicine that will give information about clinical trials that are both private and publicly funded, conducted around the world. I also would recommend having resources to do searches through whatever library resources you have for the full clinical trial that's published if it's there. If you have members of your healthcare team that go to meetings, they may be able to provide updated resources from reports from those meetings. That's something I see happen all the time when one of my colleagues goes to a meeting and they see something interesting that they think they're going to implement into practice soon. They may provide me with that information so that I can dig a little bit further. And then most institutions and most practices, and I want to make sure I am really comprehensive for all the places where patients get treated. there are resources that they can look up information and to be aware of what those are. So I always look at drug-drug interactions. When people ask me what resource do I use whichever drug-drug interaction resource is available where I'm working. Because I've worked a number of different places, I change based on what's accessible to me. And so those are things to be aware of.
I think it's really important to know what those resources at your site are, because you may have something and may have access to a medical librarian that would be extremely helpful, or like you said, getting to know the research staff well as also is just a good thing to have at your fingertips and know where to go to get those things. I just want to thank you so much. This has been so much good information today, and wanted to see if you had any final comments before we say goodbye.
Well, I guess the only comment, first of all, I've really enjoyed this. I think this is so important, and I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about my thoughts on this with you, Stephanie. If I was going to say a final comment, the thing that has really been resonating with me lately is the importance of involving patients and caregivers in their care. And we may think we always do this, but I think that with the availability of resources for patients and caregivers that may not be the resources that we would recommend, there is often some self-management that may not be the way that we would think it should be. And so the example I'm going to give is that patients often will go to resources that are focused on classic chemotherapy, which are great for classic chemotherapy, but that may not be good resources for a targeted therapy or an immune checkpoint inhibitor or a combination of the above. So I think it's really important to coordinate with patients where they should get information, that they should come back to the team and coordinate information and experiences. So I think a big issue is making sure patients and caregivers know that they need to provide information back so that we can best optimize their therapy overall. When to call, who to call, and for us to be responsive to those calls. So the success, whether that be clinical trials, I think that's essential, or if this be standard therapy that's been out there for years, or if this be new therapy, where patients really need to work as part of our team so that we can do the best we can to provide care.
Thank you. And I do thank you for joining us today. I think this has been a great discussion. What will your next shift be? That's for you to decide. Put your nursing experience to work in new ways with UC Online. From cancer registry to health informatics, UC offers a wide range of online programs designed for busy professionals. Explore your options at online.uc.edu.
Thank you for listening to the Oncology Nursing Podcast. Tell us about your favorite part of this episode by leaving a review on iTunes or wherever you download your podcasts. For more resources and information about oncology nursing, visit us at ons.org or voice.ons.org.